Hello and welcome to Deep Impact, a deep dive into Wildbow's most unloved work 5 years on. That's Elliot Diebold.
And that was Reuben Morehouse.
And we are back with Pact, Bonds 1.5. So
Yes.
when we left it, Blake and Laird had just decided to go off and get a nice relaxing coffee. And so this chapter starts with them heading off into, a coffee shop to get a coffee in one of the most intense coffee drinking scenes I've read in a while.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing just has this undercurrent of he's playing me, I'm not safe. It's not very relaxing at all. And it opens, Blake assumes they're going to like a little, small town coffee shop, but he actually takes him to sort of a big franchise thing. So that, that all feeds into that of like this whole thing where Blake's out of his depth.
Yeah. Yeah. And even though it's this bigger franchise, place, everyone immediately recognizes Laird. Like everyone, there's a scene later on where people start crowding him to just ask him about things like happening in the town. But even from the get-go, he goes to pay for the coffee, and the man behind the counter, James, is like, no, it's, don't worry about it. And Laird just kind of accepts it. And we get this quote that says, the ease with which Laird accepted suggested it was a regular thing, and it's like, oh, so he obviously comes here a fair amount and everyone just kind of knows him. And yeah, it definitely sets up this scene of everyone being on Laird's side immediately and nobody being on Blake's side.
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a power play. And I mean, I think the other thing about it is, like, I think the theme of this chapter is Blake has no idea about fucking anything.
Yeah.
And it kind of... It fed into that a bit for me because, the Blake's narration drew attention to the fact that Laird was used to getting free coffees, and I was like, well, I mean, that could just be like a chief of police thing.
Yeah,
like I've seen enough American TV to know that they often get little perks like that, at least in media, but also
especially
it could be
in small towns like this.
Yeah. But I was like, but also, it could just be some, this guy's in on the magic. Like, just about every time a character's introduced in the coffee scene, I'm like, yeah, but do you think they're in on it? Like,
yeah. And Blake just doesn't know, right? We get no indication of who's actually in on any of this throughout the whole chapter. We get some implications about it, but
Yeah, but it's sort of that whole thing of like you really feel how unsure Blake is because like I was so unsure as well, and I'm like, I don't know, they could be in and out. I have absolutely no idea where I've landed on James, the guy serving the coffee, as to whether he's in on it or not.
Yeah, but enough about the politics of small town police. So then we get our first ever bit of actual magic being cast. Laird casts. He basically takes some sugar packets and arranges them into a little symbol, and says a few words over it so that people will kind of leave them alone or just kind of ignore them,
Yeah, and it's great because it just starts with him getting coffee packets. So like you just think Blake's describing him putting putting sugar in the coffee, and then he starts pouring it on the table, and there's this sort of moment where I was like, wait, what's happening? And then he starts drawing it into a symbol, and I was like, oh, this is a magic thing. Yeah. But yeah, that was really fun. And I kind of like, all the magic so far seems to have to do with just fucking with people's perception, which is just so great. Like, because you get this image later of Blake sitting in what's essentially an empty half of the coffee shop, and the other half of the coffee shop is crowded and people are standing, but no one seems to mind. So it's just like...
no one seems to get, oh, there's seats over there.
And it's reminiscent of like that hallway scene from a few chapters ago where it's just like, it just doesn't make sense in terms of like perception, and it's great.
Yeah. So using the space that he's bought, Laird kind of takes the time to explain a bit more about how the world works. A little bit about magic and a little bit about his role as chief of police, and also kind of magical chief of police. He explains that he acts as like a protector to the town, and as his role as chief of police, the kind of spirits expect him to take care of people on the magical side as well. And that kind of ties into where his power comes from.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because he sort of goes on about how if he harms the business or something, like the spirits would be mad at him, which is interesting because it seems to imply that the spirits aren't just malicious or something. There's at least some sort of symbiotic relationship between them, because otherwise why would the spirits give a shit if a coffee shop closes or if people get stuck out in the cold? So That's interesting because so far most of the talk about others has just been like, oh, they're evil and you shouldn't deal with them. Whereas this seems to be the first implication that, you know, their relationship with humans in the area is more complicated than that.
Yes, I think one of the coolest things about the system of magic in Pact is the idea of these spirits, and we will get more information on them soon. So let's not go into it too much, but...
Sure. Yeah, well, no, it seems to be implied that almost all magic is channeled through or by spirits. So, I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. So at this point, Rose, who has not been seen since Blake kind of left the house, comes back and feeds Blake some information on Laird while he's off talking to some people in the coffee shop. Basically says that he's a chronomancer. He uses that little pocket watch that he's got as his implement to manipulate time.
Yeah, and it's cool because they like Rose sort of introduces this concept to us that the implements and maybe even the familiars are sort of symbolic of the power. So like Laird's implement and his familiar being this pocket watch tells you that he's probably going to do stuff with time and it's classic Wildbow to just build the symbolisms and the metaphors into the text to the point where even the characters are aware of it. Because that sort of symbolism, you'd expect it in a good story anyway, probably. But it's just classic Wildbow to take it to the next step and be like, well, I'm going to make the characters aware of that symbolism too, so I can just cut the bullshit and just really go to town on it, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's fun because symbolism is something of importance within the world, as well as to us, the reading audience, you know, like...
Yeah, well, just cutting the divide where symbolism's only something that is for the readers and not for the characters is a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's cool. So Laird is off talking to some people in the coffee shop, and Rose and Blake are like, oh, I feel like we're going to get played here. And then James says, hey, do you want to clear out? It's getting dark. And they realize that they've been sitting there for, a few hours without realizing.
It's hilarious because it's this whole thing where they're like, oh, we're being played. And just as you think, like, they're literally going to find Laird, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna stop this before things go wrong. And then just as they're literally halfway through that kind of thought, it goes wrong.
Yeah, exactly. It's already too late.
Because so far Blake and Rose have been freakishly good at kind of figuring stuff out on the fly. So it was great to see them kind of almost figure it out, but still get defeated anyway. They're not too crazy good at this.
It's such a simple trick. They're just sitting there. They're thinking, all right, we got to get home before it gets dark. And then it just suddenly is dark. And as the reader, we've had set up this thing of, hey, you need to get home before it gets dark because that's when people get off the street and that's when others kind of have the space to do things.
Yeah.
And so as soon as you realize, oh, it's gone dark, immediately you're like, oh shit, this has just escalated. It's very immediate. Yeah.
And Blake just starts immediately heading home, which I mean, I guess is the best idea. I see myself being paralyzed with fear in that instance, trying to spend the night in the coffee shop, but it's probably not a good idea.
Trying to not get kicked out by James. I guess one thing we didn't touch on, which would kind of get in the way of that, is people in the coffee shop openly show hostility towards Blake when they realize what family he's from.
And not just because of the magical side of that. Like, it's been set up that the town hates them because they're sitting on all this land.
Yeah, I like, again, it's kind of blurry of like, well, do they hate him because of the magical thing, or do they hate him because of who his family is, or are the two kind of tied into the same thing? It's kind of, it's cool. So Blake tries to head home, but he gets intercepted by three creepy people, one of which Blake saw in his dream at the very beginning of the story.
Yeah, they give off a kind of a Clockwork Orange vibe, I guess. Like it's,
yeah. They have this very like posh set of mannerisms, but you can tell that they're, one or two steps away from like quick and brutal violence. Yeah. So they keep referring to him, interestingly, as Rose, not able to differentiate him from Rose Senior. They'll say things like, oh, here's the rose, but where are your thorns? And things like that are very much like, can they even tell that he's not Rose Senior or perhaps Rose Junior? It's a bit ambiguous.
Well, no, I think it's Rose Senior because, like, I think in Rose's note a few chapters ago, she specifically said that since others are immortal, they tend to get mortals in the same family confused. So I'm assuming they're sort of thinking of Rose Senior. But like they seem to notice that he's different just because he isn't awakened, I guess.
Well, eventually they do. I mean, later, we're jumping ahead a bit, but one of them was like, oh, maybe we'll make you pregnant. And then one of the other one's like, no, this Rose is male. They don't do that. Like, they haven't quite put it all together.
No, well, yeah, they know he's different, but they're so out of touch with humanity that they didn't notice the gender difference. Yeah, it's odd. And there's this recurring theme of this one of the guys is just constantly talking about skin and like flaying people.
Yes, we learn later that his name is Keller.
Yeah.
Let me read out a quote here. I can flense your skin, the other man said, but without pain. The movement of air as someone enters the room will have you arching your back, whimpering in anticipation. And it's like, ooh, creepy.
It's such a creepy visual because he makes it sound so nice, but it's such a terrifying thought. It's very confusing.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that these people, look like people. And so I think we really get a bit more into why the term other works so well here, because they're just off, they talk weirdly. They don't quite get normal human things that humans would immediately understand. Their names are just slightly off from what you would expect to be normal names in this area, like they're just other.
Yeah. Well, and other seems like such a great term because we're constantly having this beat hammered into us that there's no rules when it comes to others. Like you can't try and classify them because there'll always be some sort of exception. It's a great all-encompassing thing for what I assume is going to be a very large variety of fucked up.
Yeah. So one of the three, the female one whose name is Ev, reaches out to touch Blake, and he kind of flips out when she reaches out to touch him. Says, "Don't fucking touch me," and then slaps her hand away. And then immediately realizes that he's done kind of an aggressive knee-jerk reaction, and it's bad.
Yeah, well, it's a classic, like, because he loops it back, sort of. He doesn't explicitly say it, but it's he's still kind of, doesn't like being touched from, whatever happened to him when he was living on the streets. And so it wasn't really something he consciously did, and it just kind of sucks that he's like, as he was doing it, he was like, I don't want to do this, but it was too late.
Yeah, totally. Like, he knows that it's a mistake. It's kind of this thing of like, a lion or a jaguar or something is facing you off, and doing a sudden move is probably the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
But he does it. And so they don't immediately aggressively react, but you can tell that they're kind of put off.
Yeah, their tone changes, and Blake notices evil looks in their eyes after this more and stuff, yeah.
Yes, and so Ev says, oh, it's okay, why don't you just give me your apologies? This is about where Rose comes back in and reveals that she's kind of been trying to desperately look these three up. And has this little cool moment of kind of avoiding the trap that has been left for them, saying, until we've resolved this issue of Blake's manners, I'm afraid he can't give you his apologies. It's too high a price. If he needed to make amends to someone else in the future, what would he do? And it's this moment of, hold on, wait, what?
Yeah, I read that. No, there's like, it took me a few seconds before the implication of what she was saying hit me, and I was like, man, what does that even mean? Like, that's fucking terrifying. Like, can he just not apologize? Yeah, I don't even know what it means, and I'm still terrified.
Yeah, again, it's this, and we're kind of with Blake on this one as the reader. It's magic just doesn't work in ways that you expect it to, even though it's magic. Like at every turn, it does something completely in a different sphere, and then you just get caught out by not expecting it to operate in this way.
Yeah, well, it's funny because so much fiction that has magic which follows rules and stuff. And I'm sure there's rules to this that I don't understand yet. But there's something more magical so far about the magic in this, in the sense that it defies logic. Like magic in so many things has a logic to it that I'm not seeing so far in Pact, and it's very magical.
Well, we'll get into how the magic system works later. There is an internal logic, but it's not one that you would expect from other kind of, wizard and witch style stories. It's
yeah, exactly.
Unique in its own cool way. So Rose and Blake kind of verbally joust a bit more with the three people, the three others, and kind of score a few points, enough to seemingly endear them a little bit to Padrick, who is the leader. They say, look, we know we messed up. Instead of giving you our apologies, we'll agree to give you consideration on a deal later. And, they reluctantly agree to that. And then Rose and Blake kind of leave this little scene with these three others, seemingly safe for now.
Yeah, well, and there's a weird bit where he's threatening them, and Padrick or Patrick, the leader, seems to sort of imply that there's maybe a heaven and hell in this world, and that due to Blake's lineage, he's heading to hell, or he's got some sort of debt or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's something that, like, Blake doesn't really seem to process, because that was a bit where I was like, oh shit, that's pretty bad, and he doesn't really react to it at all.
Yeah. Well, there's the concept of demons and stuff like that, so it makes sense that there is a paradise and a good place and a bad place, let's call them. Yeah, it's interesting that Blake doesn't seem to click to that, but we'll get into some more of that stuff later, I think. So Laird then kind of catches up to them and reveals that he was kind of watching them, seemingly to just kind of see how they would do if they met others, to see how kind of volatile Blake is, to see if he had any tricks up his sleeve, that kind of stuff, to basically test him.
Yeah, he makes it sound like it was a test. I don't know. Yeah, we'll talk about this a bit more later.
and he we get the payoff to the setting up the loopholes in the previous chapter, where Blake is like, well, what about a peace treaty? What about saying you would trust your daughters to someone like you, and all these things? And Laird is like, yep, well, this is the loophole for that, this is the loophole for that, this is the loophole for that. Just kind of reveals very cleanly how he just completely circumvented lying.
Well, it's funny because I actually specifically called out. I was like, Blake did such a good job at closing all these loopholes, and like I'd gone back before the last chapter's recording session and been like, yeah, I think Blake's closed most of the loopholes here. Yeah, and like I think I really underestimated how flexible the English language is. And both Blake and I guess, are gonna have to step up our loophole spotting skills.
Yeah, we'll get more a bit into this later. I've got a comment I want to read out about it. But let's just put a pin in it for now.
Sure.
So finally, Laird reveals that the three others they were talking to are fairies, and gives us some details on fairies. We'll get into this again a bit later in a monster corner. Blake is pissed at Laird, but Laird kind of drops him off back home safely and says to him, look, if I were you, I would awaken as soon as you can, because it will just help you in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, like, because Blake goes into the house angry, and he uses that anger to fuel himself studying more. But there's this bit where he kind of snaps. Like, Rose is trying to be kind of positive about the whole thing, especially because she just had a win, and she's just like, oh, well, that actually went pretty well. And Blake's like, no, it didn't. It was terrible.
No, it sucked.
And it's kind of like, this whole thing was your fucking idea. Like, I don't know. I just want to give him a little something. It's like, Rose told you not to do it.
Yeah. And then bailed you out.
Yeah, so I get that, there's emotions and stuff, so, he's just misdirecting his anger, but I was just like, no, you don't get to do that.
And the chapter ends with Blake and Rose just reading books, going back to the books.
Yeah, hit the books again. Yeah, so I don't know, this was like I don't have much to say on this chapter as a whole, I guess. We got to see some magic in action and Rose stepping up, but I think really this was just a chapter about teaching us how little we know about the world of Pact.
Us and Blake.
Yeah, exactly. So, I'm just keen to get further into it.
Yeah. So we've decided we're going to start doing a new thing to kind of dive a bit more into the time capsule, into the past here. So as Pact was being released, people were commenting on the WordPress blog that's released on. And so we have access to all these comments from 5 years ago. I thought it might be fun for us each to pick out one comment from 5 years ago to see what kind of people's vibe about the story was, when it was first coming out.
Yeah.
As well as, prod a bit of discussion about these things. So I've picked out a comment from somebody called Fantastico, which is a comment about the themes of kind of distrusting authority in Wildbow's work. So obviously at the time we had Worm, which obviously has themes of distrusting authority. And then Pact, right off the gate, sets Blake against the police, right? I mean, the chief of police, at least, which implies that he'll be set against the entire police force, at least by association.
Yeah, and even less concretely, he hates like his dad or his parents and his grandparents, which is sort of a type of authority, really, like in down family lines.
Yeah, which it's a fun little connection to notice, we'll probably link these comments in the description so you can see the full things. But one of the other things I liked about this comment was it points out some of the nonsense with these loopholes. For example, Laird could show up at the door in a panic and say, "I swear that people are coming to get you right now, and if you don't run, you're going to die." And the meaning for that could actually be, your relatives are coming to get you for the funeral, and if you don't exercise, you'll die at some point. And that would just work with within the system of loopholes. I like this.
Yeah, it's definitely like it's pointing out a lot of just how flexible this stuff is, and I'm sure we'll get a better understanding as time goes on. He's right.
One of the things to point out is the loopholes can be avoided just based off kind of the meaning behind it. And you don't really, even though you know the words, you don't really know the meaning. And you can basically warp the language to say whatever you want and still be technically telling the truth, you know?
Yeah.
What comment did you pick out?
Yeah, so I picked out a sort of early comment fairly on, but it was by a user called Notes, and they were just discussing Laird's motive, and it's less. Notes comment raising all these questions about why Laird did what he did, but I really liked a response from Farmer Bob 1, who sort of mentions that Laird may have been trying to make Blake paranoid and encourage him to stay in the house and not trust anyone. It's kind of like the first test may have been Blake agreeing to go with him was a test that Blake failed, and this whole thing has really been a scheme to make sure that Blake will never do that again. Yeah. And that was just a really interesting angle and a fun discussion in the comments.
Yeah, something I liked in this comment was they pointed out, yes, Laird kept his word, technically, but Blake isn't an other. He's still going to harbour resentment because Laird deceived him, even though he didn't technically lie. Like, it doesn't quite make sense what Laird was doing unless he was trying to get Blake not on his side, really.
Yeah, and so I like this angle that he's just trying to make Blake paranoid in general, because that actually kind of aligns most of what he did better than most of the alternatives. Yeah.
Something else I really like to see in the comments was there was a lot of speculation on what Blake's implement was going to be. So there were some like a multi-tool or a paintbrush to kind of fit Blake's like handyman vibe and demonstrate his different talents. Someone else pointed out maybe a smartphone, which I don't know what the symbolic weight behind that is, but I just think it would be so funny to have a smartphone as like a magical implement. Sounded like a really funny idea. So hopefully it'll be that.
I saw one comment speculating that it might be a mirror, which I thought was a great one, and also allows him to keep Rose handy.
Yeah, totally.
So I like that idea, but the multi-tool one does fit Blake's character as we understand it so far very well. So yeah, I'm interested to see.
That's the end of our discussion on the chapter. But before we go, we've met a new other, and that means it's time for a new Monster Corner. We're going to talk about fairies here. So fairies have a very kind of broad mythology. I was researching it, and basically fairies can really be anything. But based off the names of the three that we meet, which are Padraig, Kelland, and Esselt, these are all like Celtic or Irish names, and so we're going to focus on like Celtish or Irish fairy folklore. That's what it kind of seems to be hinting that they're kind of based in, right?
Sure.
So the qualities of the fairies that we meet are they're, eternal. They have these otherworldly kind of senses. They don't seem to care too much for physical violence and like wordplay, except then they seem to have this undercurrent of really wanting to just do kind of Westworld-esque brutal violence at times.
Well, it's kind of like they don't like chaotic violence. Like, he's talking about sitting someone down and flaying them. So they're not against violence. Yeah. They're kind of against just sort of recklessness, I guess.
Yeah. And Laird gives us one sentence, which is going to be pretty important, which is, he says, they're men and women desperate to entertain themselves over a very long time. And so we get this idea of fairies as, in Pact, as Eternals who just kind of get bored, and are just seeking to do things to entertain themselves, right?
Yeah, well, and there's other bits of his dialogue where he implies that they've been exiled and maybe they've been around humans so long that they're not 100% fairies. And you know, there's a comment in another chapter about fairies that thought they were vampires or something. So it's kind of clear that for fairies, at least, there's some malleability in exactly what they are.
Which is a Twilight reference, which is great.
Yeah.
So anyway, traditionally fairies are, you know, humanoid, they're small, they have wings, and they're mischievous, right? But this is a kind of different explanation for their mischievousness. They're not like tricky, they just want to entertain themselves. And so playing tricks on people is just a fun way to go about things, right?
Yeah, they're not malicious or anything, they're just entertaining themselves.
Yeah, they're bored. And I kind of like the parallel with something like Westworld, where they're eternal, they have access to this big old world, and they don't want to mess it up too much, but they kind of just want to have fun, you know? And so that kind of takes the same shape that, you know, Westworld posits that humans would do, right? So fairies, though, are quite broad term, as I mentioned. So in Ireland, there are a number of different creatures that they would refer to as fairies from different places. So there's like headless horsemen, ghosts, leprechauns, banshees, like shapeshifters. It's a pretty generic term. And there's also quite a strong tie to like the concept of Tolkien's elves. Those kinds of elves where they're, you know, eternal, they have a connection with nature or with magic, and they have this strong concept of like lineage and bloodlines innately.
Yeah.
We do get a line of Patrick as an exiled prince. So diving into the royalty angle, there's often this idea of like courts and royalty within fairies. Fairies often have this like fairy realm where they're from. Interestingly, in Celtic fairy mythology, there isn't often reference to like courts or royalty structures, but there's almost always a fairy queen. So it's a bit weird where they don't have this idea of like, they don't have this idea of royalty, but they always have like a queen. So I'm not really sure how that kind of squares away, but yeah, there's always like an implication of royalty lines, but not necessarily any actual reference to them. One more thing I want to point out is fairies almost always have this power of illusion, referred to as like glamour. Basically shapeshifters, or they can make themselves invisible or stuff like that. So yeah, I guess I know we're going to see more of the fairies of Patrick and his crew in Pact.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So we'll have to see how much this kind of stuff aligns with the mythology here.
Yeah, well, because so far, I mean, a lot of this is so generic and malleable, but so far this kind of lines up with what we understand about others in general. So yeah,
it's interesting. I think the others we've seen so far, we've seen the bird skull creatures, we've seen the fairies. There's going to be a bunch more of weird ones. It's going to be fun kind of diving into them here. One more piece of advice to Blake. I found out a lot about how to ward off fairies to protect yourself. I mean, you know, like, obviously fairies aren't real, but people would do these things as like superstitious things to ward off like bad luck or things that seem like bad luck, but are actually fairies playing tricks on you. And the one I liked the most was wearing clothes inside out is apparently meant to ward off fairies. Because they like get confused and then their confusion gives you enough time to escape before they cast any tricks on you.
Who came up with that? Like in real life?
Yeah, I'm not sure. But it's interesting because it kind of ties into how Patrick and the others seem to work, where they seem smart about so many things, but just weird little things will stump them, you know, like they don't get male and female human anatomy and stuff like that.
Yeah, they're so detached from the mortal realm in some ways that
Yeah, so we get this characterization of fairies as smart and love tricking people, but also, like, they can just get really easily tricked themselves by simple things, which is fun. And we'll see how that plays in, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I think that's everything.
Yeah, that does us for Bonds 1.5. If you're enjoying the show, please review us on iTunes so that we can get out there in front of more people. There's a link to do that in the show notes down below.
Yes, we've also got a website, mediamdpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Twitter and Facebook, and you can give us a like or a shout out on those platforms.
Yep, and you'll find links to our discussion threads there, as well as in the show notes. So if you want, you can jump into the Reddit and leave comments for us and talk more about what you thought about the chapter and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and so our next episode will be out on Monday, the 7th of January. We're going to be settling in now, much like Wildbird did 5 years ago, to this, what is for us a Monday and Friday release schedule.
Yep. So that will be Bonds 1.6, and we will see you on the 7th.
See ya.